morning I signed a deed on the beach house in Beaufort, South Carolina. I sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee and watched the tide come in. 63 years old, retired, and finally, 63 years old, retired, and finally, somewhere quiet enough that I could hear myself think. The salt air came off the water slow and easy. A pelican landed on the dock post and just sat there like it owned the place. I laughed out loud at that. Felt like the first real laugh I'd had in years. I want to tell you how I got here, because it didn't happen the way most people's retirement stories go. My name is Everett. I spent 31 years building a commercial landscaping company out of nothing. Started with a second-hand mower, a beat-up Ford F-150, and 3 clients who paid me in checks that sometimes bounced. By the time I sold the company 6 years ago, we had 42 employees, contracts with 2 hospital systems, a university, and more strip malls than I ever want to count again. The sale netted me a little over $4 million after taxes. I didn't tell anyone, not a soul. I put the money into a brokerage account, kept my old truck, and started looking for somewhere peaceful to retire. I'd earned that peace. I want to be clear about that, because the rest of this story is going to make you wonder why I didn't fight back sooner. The answer is that I spent so many years being reasonable that it became a habit I had to unlearn. My son, I'll call him by the name his mother gave him, which was the last generous thing she did before she left us both. His name was Donovan. He was 34 when the story starts. Good-looking kid. Smart when he chose to be, and so completely under his wife's thumb that I'm not sure he ever had an original thought after their wedding day. His wife's name was Petra. She was the kind of woman who smiled at you with her whole face and meant absolutely nothing by it. I knew what she was. The first time I met her, at a dinner downtown where she spent 45 minutes explaining to me why my business model was inefficient. She'd never run a business. She worked in pharmaceutical sales, but she had opinions about everything and the confidence of someone who has never once been wrong in her own estimation. Donovan and Petra got married when he was 26. I paid for the wedding, $48,000 at a venue outside Charleston. Open bar, 5-piece band, the whole thing. I didn't complain. I was his father. That's what you do. The trouble started 6 months after the wedding, when Petra decided that Donovan needed to find his real family, by which she meant her family, her mother, her 2 sisters, her brother-in-law who sold insurance and thought every conversation was a sales call. Holidays shifted, then Sunday dinners. Then the calls got shorter and further apart. And when I did call Donovan's cell, Petra would often answer and tell me he was busy. He was always busy. He was never too busy to go to her parents' lake house in Georgia, but he was always too busy for me. I want to tell you about the Thanksgiving I drove 4 hours to their house in Columbia because Donovan had finally, after 2 years of excuses, invited me for the holiday. I brought a pecan pie from a bakery I liked, a bottle of good bourbon, and a card with $200 in it for the new baby, my grandson, who was 6 weeks old and whose name I'd learned from a mass text message sent to what appeared to be everyone Donovan had ever met. I knocked on the door. Petra answered. She looked at me the way you look at someone who shows up on the wrong day and said, "Oh, Everett, we're actually doing dinner with my family tonight. I thought Donovan told you." She had not let him tell me. I found that out later from a friend of his who still spoke to me. I turned around, got back in the truck, and drove home. Ate a drive-through burger on I-26. Couldn't tell you what it tasted like. That was the beginning of 11 years of the same thing, in different forms. There was a pattern to it. Whenever Petra wanted something from me, money, a favor, help with something she couldn't get elsewhere, Donovan would suddenly call. His voice would go warm in a way that made my chest hurt, because I still recognized my son in it, underneath everything. He'd ask how I was doing. He'd mention my grandson, who I had seen exactly 4 times in his first 3 years of life. And then, usually by the second or third phone call, whatever it was would come up. The roof needed replacing. They were short on the down payment for a new house. Could I co-sign a car loan? I said yes more times than I should have. I kept thinking the relationship would come back around. It never did. The calls stopped again the moment the need was met. The last time it happened, I was 59. I just sold the company. Donovan called 3 times in 1 week, which was more than he'd called in the previous year combined. I told myself not to read into it. On the third call, he said he and Petra were thinking of opening a restaurant, and they needed a silent investor. And had I ever considered diversifying my retirement portfolio? He said it just like that, like it was a business proposal. I told him I'd think about it. I did think about it. I did think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks, and then I called him back and said I wasn't in a position to invest. There was a pause on the line that told me everything. He said, okay. He said he'd talk to me soon. He did not talk to me soon. He did not talk to me soon. I didn't hear from my son for 11 months after that call. I used those 11 months well. I sold my house in Greenville, put everything in storage, took a road trip up the coast, and eventually found Beaufort. The town had been there forever and didn't feel the need to prove anything to anybody. I liked that. I rented a small place for 6 months while I looked around, and then I bought the beach house. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a dock that needed work but had good bones. I paid cash. I didn't tell Donovan. I hadn't spoken to Donovan in almost a year. I didn't figure it was any of his business. I fixed up the dock myself, mostly, hired a local contractor named Aldous for the structural work, and did the finish work on my own. I planted things. I learned to fish properly. Not just the impatient half-hour kind I'd done all my life, but the sit there and wait kind that requires you to be comfortable in your own head. I got comfortable. It took a while, but I got there. My grandson, who was now 10 years old and who I had met enough times to count on one hand, sent me a birthday card that year. His handwriting was careful and a little crooked. He'd drawn a boat on the front. I put it on the refrigerator and left it there. Then one Thursday in October, my phone rang. Donovan. The warmth was back in his voice. He asked how I was. He said he'd been thinking about me. He said he was sorry it had been so long. I sat on the porch and listened and said the things you say, the reflexive things, the I'm fine, it's good to hear from you things, because even after everything, he was still my son, and some part of me was still waiting. He asked if I'd settled somewhere. I told him I was in Beaufort. He said that was wonderful. He said Petra had always loved the coast. I should have heard it right then. Maybe I did, and I chose not to. 3 more calls over the next 2 weeks. Each one a little warmer, a little longer, a little more about how things were different now, how Petra had changed, how he'd been doing a lot of reflection. On the 4th call, he said they were having some financial trouble. The restaurant idea hadn't panned out. There was no restaurant, it turned out. Had never been more than an idea. And Petra's job had some instability, and they were just going through a tough patch. He said it so easily, like we were the kind of father and son who talked about these things. I asked how my grandson was doing. Donovan said he was great, actually thriving, and then moved right back to the financial situation. I asked what he needed. He said he wasn't asking for anything. He just thought it might be nice if they came to visit. See where I was living, spend some time together. He thought it would be good for my grandson to know his grandfather better. That one landed. He knew it would. I said okay. I said they could come for a long weekend. I said I had the room. I should tell you what I was thinking, because I've asked myself many times since. I think I was thinking that my grandson was 10 years old and that I had missed most of his life, and that whatever I thought of Petra, the boy had nothing to do with any of it. I think I was also thinking, somewhere I didn't want to look directly, that maybe Donovan meant it this time. Maybe the years had changed something. I made peace with the fact that wanting that was not stupidity. It was just being a father. But I should have been smarter about what I was walking into. They arrived on a Friday afternoon in a rental car that was nicer than anything they'd driven when they were supposedly doing fine. Donovan looked older than I expected, and tired, and he hugged me on the porch with what felt like genuine relief. My grandson, whose name was Cody, stood back a little and looked at the water like it was the first thing that had interested him all day. Petra stepped out of the car last, in sunglasses and a linen shirt, and looked at the house the way a person looks at something they're trying to appraise without appearing to appraise it. She said it was charming. She said it was charming. She said it right away, before she'd even gotten to the porch. Charming. But she was doing me a favor with the word. The first evening was fine. We had dinner on the porch. Cody ate 2 plates of shrimp. The conversation stayed in safe territory. Donovan helped me clean up without being asked. I thought, maybe. I kept thinking, maybe. The second morning, Petra was up before everyone else. I found her at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she'd made herself, which was fine, and with what appeared to be the property tax document I'd left on the counter, which was not. She set it down when I walked in and smiled and said she'd just picked it up by accident. I poured my coffee and said nothing. At lunch, she mentioned that 3 bedrooms was really more than one person needed. I let that pass too. I shouldn't have. But I was still doing the math on whether saying something would cost me the chance to know my grandson. That afternoon, while Cody and I were out on the dock, he was asking questions about the pelicans, real questions, smart ones, and I was thinking this kid had been raised by people who didn't deserve him. Donovan came and sat beside me and started talking. He talked for a while about nothing, circling something. And finally he said that he'd been thinking, and Petra had been thinking, and they wondered if maybe it would make sense for them to come down for a longer stretch. Not permanently, he said quickly, just while they got back on their feet. He said Cody could finish the school year remotely. He said it would be good for everyone. I asked him where they'd sleep. He said the 2 guest rooms. I looked at my grandson, who was watching a pelican with complete concentration, and I thought about what I was going to say very carefully before I said it. I told Donovan I needed to think about it. He nodded like that was reasonable. Petra, I noticed, was watching us from the back porch. That night I called my attorney. Her name was Sylvia, and she'd been handling my affairs since the business sale. And she was the kind of person who asked exactly the right questions without wasting any time getting to them. I told her the situation. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Everett, you need to know that in South Carolina, if you allow someone to stay in your home for more than a certain period without a formal agreement, the removal process gets complicated." She told me what I needed to know. I thanked her, and I sat on the porch for a long time afterward listening to the water. I also made some calls the next morning, one to my banker, one to a friend from church who happened to be a retired sheriff's deputy and who I trusted completely. His name was Wendell. And when I told him what was going on, he said, "You want me to be around Sunday evening?" I told him I might. He said he'd be available. Sunday morning at breakfast, Petra brought it up directly. She said she'd been doing some research on the Beaufort rental market, and given the size of the house, it only made sense for them to contribute something if they stayed, though of course that could be worked out flexibly. She said it like she was offering me something. She said it like moving her family into my house was a reasonable exchange for some amount that had not been specified and would, I was certain, never solidify into anything real. Donovan sat across from her and did not look at me. I said I had something to take care of before we talked about that, and I excused myself and went to my room and made one more call. When I came back out, Cody was eating cereal and watching something on his tablet, and Donovan and Petra were talking quietly and stopped when they heard me coming. I sat down. I told them I'd thought about it. I told them I was glad they had come, and I was especially glad I'd gotten to spend time with Cody, who was a fine young man. Then I told them that I wouldn't be able to have them stay. Petra's face did something complicated. She said she didn't understand. She said after everything, meaning after 11 years of excluding me from my own family, she was now framing their moving into my house as something owed. She actually said the words, "After everything we've been through." I want to make sure that's clear, because when she said it, I felt something settle in me, some last remaining hope that this had been a misunderstanding, and I was glad to feel it go. I told her that I had spoken with my attorney and that I had documented the terms under which they'd been invited, a weekend visit, and that those terms were not changing. I told them both that they were welcome to stay through Sunday as planned, and that I'd be happy to help Cody with the doc one more time before they left. I told Donovan that I loved him because that was still true, and that I hoped the situation he was in resolved itself, and that I was not going to be the resolution. Donovan said my name once, just once, in a voice that almost worked on me. Petra said if that was how I was going to be, then maybe they should just leave now. I said that was certainly their choice. I got up and poured myself more coffee. Wendell showed up that afternoon, ostensibly to return a fishing rod I'd lent him. He stayed for 2 hours and was cheerful and big and completely unhurried. And Donovan and Petra left at 4 o'clock without much in the way of goodbye. Cody stopped at the door and looked back at me and said he liked the pelicans. I told him they'd be here whenever he wanted to come back. He nodded like he was filing that information away somewhere he trusted. After their car left, I sat back down on the porch. Same pelican on the same dock post, probably. The tide was going out. Here is the thing that took me a long time to understand, and that I want to say plainly because I think some of you have been in some version of this situation, and maybe nobody has said it to you directly. You do not owe anyone access to the life you built. Not even the people you love. Loving someone and allowing them to dismantle what you've worked for are not the same obligation, and confusing them will cost you everything, slowly, in a way that's hard to see until it's already happened. I heard from Donovan 3 weeks later. He sent a text, which is how I knew Petra had not written it. It said he was sorry for the way things had gone and that he hoped I was doing okay. I wrote back and told him I was doing fine and that the offer stood. He was welcome to visit with proper notice, and Cody was welcome whenever he could manage it. That was 6 months ago. He hasn't taken me up on it yet. But Cody sent another card, Christmas this time, store-bought, with a note inside in that careful, crooked handwriting that said he hoped I was catching good fish and that he wanted to come back and see the pelicans sometime. He signed it with his full name, which made me laugh and then made me miss him in a way I didn't know how to name. I wrote him back. I told him the pelicans were doing fine. I told him there was a rod here with his name on it whenever his parents said the word. I told him his grandfather was proud of him, even though I had barely gotten to watch him grow up, and that this house was always going to have a place for him in it. I sealed the envelope and walked it to the mailbox in the salt air, and on the way back I watched the sun go sideways across the water, that particular late afternoon light that Beaufort does better than anywhere I've ever been. And I thought about 31 years of work and the truck that barely started in January and the clients whose checks bounced, and Donovan at 7 years old showing me a lizard he'd found in the backyard with the complete conviction that it was the most extraordinary lizard in the history of the world. I don't know what's coming next. I know the water's here, and the dock's solid, and the third bedroom has clean sheets in it. Some things you can't control. Some things you don't need to. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, trying to figure out what the honest version of the lesson is. Not the clean version, not the one that wraps up neatly with a bow, the actual one. Here's what I know. Every choice I made for 11 years had a consequence I could feel but couldn't always name. Every time I wired money to Donovan without asking for accountability, I was teaching him that I could be accessed without being respected. Every time I let a holiday go by without saying anything, I was telling Petra that the boundaries she was drawing around my son had no cost. I wasn't being gracious. I was being afraid. Afraid that pushing back would mean losing him entirely, which is exactly what happened anyway, just slower and more expensive. The cause and the effect weren't dramatic. They never are. They accumulated. 11 years of small surrenders, And at the end of it, I was standing in a drive-thru on I-26, eating a burger by myself on Thanksgiving because I'd driven 4 hours to be turned away at the door without a second thought. That didn't happen because of one bad decision. It happened because of 100 reasonable ones that added up to something unreasonable. What I had to learn, and I want to be straight with you about how long it took, is that intelligence without honesty is just cleverness pointed in the wrong direction. I was smart enough to see what Petra was doing from the very first dinner. I was not honest enough with myself or with Donovan to say it out loud. I kept choosing the comfortable short-term peace over the harder long-term truth, and I kept paying for that choice in currency I couldn't get back. Years, holidays, the grandson I barely knew. The morning Petra picked up my property tax document off my kitchen counter and set it back down and smiled. Something in me stopped making excuses. Not anger. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't rage that made me call Sylvia that night. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you've finally been honest with yourself long enough that you can see the shape of a situation without flinching. That's what I mean when I talk about intelligence. Not credentials, not cleverness. The willingness to see clearly and then act on what you see, even when it costs you something. And the nerve it takes to do that. To sit across from your son at a breakfast table and say no, not out of cruelty, but out of self-respect. That's not something that comes from nowhere. It comes from years of building something, surviving something, getting back up enough times that you stop being afraid of the fall. I spent 31 years building a business from a second-hand mower and a truck that barely started in January. That kind of work doesn't just build a company, it builds the part of you that knows what you're worth. Cody's Christmas card is still on my refrigerator. His crooked handwriting, the note about the pelicans. That kid didn't earn any of what happened in his family, and the fact that he reached out anyway, that's character. Whatever Donovan and Petra taught him by accident, he came out with something intact. I think about that more than anything else from this whole story. You can't go back and undo 11 years. What you can do is decide, clearly and without apology, what the next 11 look like.